I came home to find 6 strangers in wide-brimmed hats doing synchronized water aerobics in my backyard pool, while Karen sipped Rosa on my lounge chair like she owned the place. And that was the exact moment I decided to build a voltage alarm that would make them all scream like raccoons caught in a trash can. For most people, retirement means peace, maybe a little gardening, maybe crossword puzzles on the porch. For me, it meant facing off against the HOA president who thought my property was an extension of her backyard vision board. It started subtle enough. Karen Monroe, with her clipboard and fox-concerned smile, would appear at the fence and point out things like weeds, a slightly tilted mailbox, or how my American flag wasn't the right size for a pole of that height. I used to think she was just overly involved. Now I know she's the kind of person who thinks a neighbor's silence is permission. When I first bought the house, the pool was what sealed the deal. After 30 years as a firefighter, I wanted somewhere quiet to stretch out sore joints, float under the sun, and host my 2 grandkids on weekends. I made it clear in every HOA meeting that the pool was on my private land, surrounded by my locked fence, and maintained by me alone. No community access, no shared usage. Everyone understood. Everyone except Karen. She had a way of phrasing things that sounded like suggestions, but were really commands. At the last HOA barbecue, I caught her telling a new resident that the neighborhood was lucky to have such a generous homeowner like me who allowed community use of his pool during hot weeks. I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. Then I found out she'd already handed out 6 spare keys to her closest friends from yoga. When I confronted her in the parking lot, she waved me off with a fake laugh and said she was just trying to build community vibes. That Sunday I installed new locks, but Monday, while driving back from volunteering with the local EMT unit, I got a motion alert from my back camera. I opened the feed, and there it was, Karen and 3 women walking around my pool with pool noodles and coolers. One of them kicked off her shoes right onto my tomato plants. They stayed for 3 hours. I arrived home to wet patio cushions, a half-empty wine bottle under my deck chair, and a damp towel hung over my grill lid. The audacity was stunning. No note, no apology, just footprints and glitter sunscreen streaks in the shallow end. I took the footage to the next HOA meeting. Karen didn't even flinch. She claimed it was a clerical error, a mix-up of addresses. She even suggested I could volunteer the pool for the next ladies of the HOA social, since you're clearly passionate about community safety and water features. The room fell into awkward silence. Then someone snickered. Karen smirked like she'd won something. That night I couldn't sleep. It wasn't just the trespassing. It was the entitlement, the deliberate overreach, the smugness in her eyes. She was used to pushing people until they gave up just to avoid dealing with her. I wasn't going to be one of those people. I spent the next few days re-watching every second of security footage, not just from the pool, but from the front gate, city yard, and even the old shed cam I'd installed years ago when the raccoons got bold. Karen wasn't even trying to hide it. She had a copied key. She used it midweek when she knew I was gone. Each time she brought new people, hosted little wine parties, poolside yoga, even had someone bring a portable speaker system once. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted a solution that screamed without me needing to raise my voice. That's when the idea hit, something that wouldn't hurt anyone but would definitely stop them in their tracks. I sketched it out on paper first, a voltage-sensitive alarm system, harmless but obnoxiously loud, with motion sensors tied to a waterproof speaker system and a flashing LED board. The idea was simple. You step too close to the pool without the system recognizing your Bluetooth ID. The entire setup starts howling like a tornado siren during a parade. Not just that. The flashing sign would light up and display a warning, something dramatic, something unforgettable. But before that, I needed to be sure. One last confirmation. Wednesday afternoon, I pretended to be gone, parked my truck around the block, and watched from the upstairs bathroom with a thermos of iced coffee. Like clockwork, Karen and her ladies walked right in, laughing, carrying bags and towels. She opened the gate with a silver key. I watched as they made themselves at home again, clinking glasses and taking photos. She even posted one on her social media with the caption, "Summer vibes with the crew. My fence, my pool, My life turned into her Instagram prop. I didn't walk down. I didn't yell. I just went back upstairs and started assembling the hardware kit I'd been building in the garage. If Karen loved her little pool party so much, I was going to give her one she'd remember for the rest of her life. One that involved a siren, a light show, and a very public announcement of her HOA-style breaking and entering. I had the tools. I had the footage. And most importantly, I had the patience to make it perfect. The morning after Karen's latest trespass, I woke up early and sat with my notebook and a cup of black coffee at the patio table, staring out at the pool like it was some crime scene. The water was still rippling gently from the wind, but I could still see the ghost of her floating drink tray and the glitter residue clinging to the tiles. My backyard had been invaded not by strangers but by someone who believed she had the right to ignore the boundaries of decency. I needed to make this stop, and not with arguments or HOA complaints that went nowhere. I needed to build something that spoke louder than words. That morning I sketched the blueprint. It wouldn't be dangerous, not even close, but it would be dramatic. I didn't want anyone getting hurt. I just wanted them shocked, confused, and most importantly, too embarrassed to ever step foot near my pool again. My plan revolved around three main components. First, I needed a trigger, something that could detect when someone was in the water without permission. Second, a reaction system, something that could respond in a big way, loud and unavoidable. And third, a message that made it crystal clear this was not some neighborhood attraction. This was private property, and they were not welcome to treat it like a community spa. I headed to the hardware store with a list: waterproof motion sensors, external speakers, a battery-powered siren, some LED strip lights, and a few odds and ends to connect it all together. The guy at the counter gave me a strange look when I unloaded everything. I told him I was trying to keep raccoons out of my koi pond. He nodded like that was completely normal. Back at home, I opened up my old workshop in the garage. I used to tinker with projects when I had more time. Little things like fixing radios, building weatherproof casings for sprinkler systems, rewiring lights around the garden. This was going to be my biggest one yet. I started by building a platform inside the pool pump housing where I could tuck in the voltage alarm system. I didn't need actual electricity in the water. That would be reckless and criminal. What I built instead was a series of submersible pressure-sensitive tiles that detected unusual movement and weight in the shallow end. These tiles were connected via waterproof wiring to a relay box tucked under the deck. From there, the signal would go to the speaker system and LED panel mounted to the fence. The alarm would only activate if two conditions were met: movement in the pool and no Bluetooth signal from my personal phone or smartwatch. If I was home or invited someone in, the alarm would stay off. But if I was gone and someone snuck in thinking it was just another pool day, the whole thing would light up and scream like a jet engine. Testing took a few days. I set up the sensors and placed heavy weights in the water to simulate a person stepping in. The first few attempts were buggy. The alarm would blare during wind gusts or when a bird landed on the edge. I adjusted the sensitivity, rewrote the trigger sequence, and added a short delay so it wouldn't go off the second someone dipped a toe. It needed to wait until there was full entry into the water. On the fourth day of tweaking, I finally got it right. I waited until midnight, turned on the system, walked into the pool barefoot while holding my phone with Bluetooth off, and splash, sirens, flashing lights, and a blaring voice recording I had programmed that said, "Trespasser detected. Leave the premises immediately." I nearly slipped laughing. It was glorious. To the average person, it probably seemed excessive, but I wasn't dealing with average people. I was dealing with someone who took politeness as weakness, someone who thought rules only applied to others. I'd filed reports with the HOA before. I'd tried letters, emails, conversations. None of it worked. Karen didn't respond to logic. She responded to control and attention. So I was going to take control and give her all the attention she wanted, in the worst possible way. While the system was physically installed and tested, I also set up cameras with better angles. I swapped out my older camera over the side gate for a newer model with night vision and facial tracking. I relocated one of the patio cameras to face the pool directly. This wasn't just about catching her in the act again. I needed indisputable footage of her using that stolen key. I needed to show the HOA, and maybe even law enforcement, that this wasn't a one-time fluke or neighborhood misunderstanding. This was repeated trespassing. With the new camera angles, I could now see everything from the moment she unlocked the gate to the second her sunscreen-soaked foot hit the water. In the meantime, I kept my routine normal. I waved to neighbors, I mowed the lawn, I trimmed the hedges, but I didn't mention a thing about the system, not even to the neighbors I trusted. This had to catch her completely off guard. If even a whisper of the plan got out, she might back off just long enough to avoid the alarm. I wanted her confidence intact. I wanted her walking in again, smug and sure she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. To bait her, I left subtle clues that I was gone. I parked my truck further away on certain days. I turned off the front porch light even when I was inside. I even let the grass grow slightly longer than usual, something that always bothered her, to make it seem like I wasn't keeping up with maintenance. I wanted her to think I had left town or gone off for a weekend trip. I even posted a vague picture on my social media of a lake with no caption, just to sell the illusion. The final piece was the sign. I custom ordered a waterproof LED board from an online electronics store and mounted it to the fence facing the pool. The message was short, bright red, and impossible to miss. It would flash in sequence with the sirens and voice recording. Trespasser detected. Property under surveillance. Leave immediately. I tested it from across the yard and could see it clearly even in bright sunlight. Everything was set. The trap was built, the cameras positioned, and the system tested. Now all I had to do was wait. Karen had a pattern. Every Wednesday around noon, she held her so-called ladies' social. It wasn't on any official calendar, but my cameras had caught it 3 times before. She'd show up, key in, parade around like she was doing everyone a favor by using my pool, and then leave without a trace except for wet towels and floating plastic cups. This coming Wednesday, I wasn't going to stop her. I was going to let her walk right into it. Then the alarm would speak louder than I ever could. By the time Wednesday morning rolled around, the air was thick with summer heat and anticipation. I was up early, pacing my living room like a man about to pull off a bank heist. Everything had been checked twice the night before. The sensors were active. The siren and speakers had been tested one last time under a full moon, and the waterproof LED sign mounted on the fence was charged and armed. I brewed a cup of coffee but barely touched it. Instead of my usual routine of tending to the garden or doing the crossword, I packed a small duffel bag and drove my truck down the road, parking it 2 blocks away behind the convenience store. I didn't want Karen or any of her crew seeing it in the driveway and thinking twice. From there, I circled back on foot through the alley behind my property and slipped into the shed. It was stifling in there, but it had the best angle for watching everything through the live feed from the mounted cameras. I plugged in my phone, adjusted the tiny fan I had rigged for air, and waited. Just before noon, I saw the side gate open on the monitor. Karen strutted in wearing oversized sunglasses and a floral beach wrap that looked like it was trying way too hard. Right behind her came 4 of her friends, each toting purses, water bottles, towels, and floaties. One woman had a Bluetooth speaker already bumping soft jazz. Karen unlocked the pool gate with the stolen key like she'd done it 100 times. No hesitation, no shame. The others followed behind her, gushing about how lucky they were to have access to such a clean pool without needing a resort membership. I sat back in the shed and smiled as Karen dragged a deck chair into the exact spot she liked and started pouring drinks from a thermos into plastic goblets. She didn't waste time. Within minutes, she had kicked off her sandals and was at the edge of the pool, dipping her toes in with dramatic flair like she was in some overpriced travel commercial. I glanced down at the sensor control screen on my laptop. The green light blinked once. The system had registered movement. I muted my phone and watched. Karen stood, stretched, and announced something to her friends that I could only partly hear from the audio pickup. It sounded like she said no one would bother them today. Then she took a full step into the pool. The sensor clicked. The speakers exploded with a bone-rattling siren that echoed across the entire block. Lights burst to life around the fence like someone had turned on a concert stage. The LED sign blazed in red, flashing text. Trespasser DTCTED. Leave immediately. The siren had a shrill tone layered beneath the bass, a kind of wailing alert that sounded half alien, half apocalypse. Karen screamed and slipped into the shallow end with a splash. One of her friends yelped and dropped her drink. Another tripped over a towel trying to run. The woman with the speaker panicked and tried to shut it off, not realizing the alarm was coming from the mounted fence system and not the speaker she brought. From the shed, I switched cameras to get a full view of the chaos. Karen was flailing in the water, soaking wet and furious, yelling something I couldn't quite catch over the blaring sound. The other women were scrambling toward the gate, but tripping over each other like startled goats. Someone banged into the float rack and knocked it over. Another fell trying to gather her bag and ended up crawling through the landscaping mulch. I nearly choked on my own laughter watching it unfold. Neighbors began pouring into their backyards, peering over fences or standing on lawn chairs. Phones came out immediately. One neighbor even started live streaming the whole thing with commentary, speculating aloud if it was a home invasion or a fire drill. Karen finally pulled herself out of the pool and marched toward the alarm panel, which of course was locked behind a reinforced casing. She banged on it, dripping wet, mascara streaked down her face like war paint, screaming about property rights and lawsuits. That was my cue. I stepped out of the shed, walked calmly around the house, and emerged through the side gate as if I had just arrived. Karen spotted me instantly and pointed a trembling finger in my direction like I was a cartoon villain. Her voice cracked with rage as she demanded I shut off the system immediately. I said nothing. I just walked up to the control box, swiped my phone to deactivate the Bluetooth override, and the siren cut off instantly. The sudden silence was deafening. Everyone froze. The LED sign blinked one last time and turned off. Karen stood there panting, soaked, her hair flattened, her rage bubbling just under the surface. I looked at her calmly and asked what she and her guests were doing in my private pool without permission. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes darted to the neighbors watching, the phone still pointed at her, the silence now filled with tension. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small USB stick. I told her I had footage of every single time she had entered my property using a key she wasn't authorized to have. 3 times in the last 30 days, each time captured clearly. I said I was willing to present this to the HOA or the police, whichever came first. Karen tried to pivot. She claimed it was an honest mistake, that she was under the impression the pool was part of community amenities. One of her friends nodded like that would somehow make it all okay. I raised my eyebrows and reminded her that she had just told her friends nobody would bother them today. Hard to claim ignorance when you're boasting about not getting caught. I could feel the shift in the crowd. The neighbors weren't just amused anymore. They were annoyed. One even shouted that this wasn't the first time Karen had acted like she owned the block. Another called her entitled. Karen's confidence cracked. Her voice trembled as she tried to accuse me of setting a trap. I shrugged and said, I simply installed a home security system to deter trespassers. She had activated it. That was all. The group of women gathered their things quietly. One of them apologized under her breath as she slipped past me. Karen, however, stood there defiantly for another minute before storming off with a loud threat about legal action. I waved goodbye and said I looked forward to seeing her in court. The moment the gate clicked shut behind them, I heard scattered applause from over the fences. Someone shouted, "Nice one, Max." I gave a quick nod and headed back inside. It wasn't just about the alarm. It was about restoring my peace, and I had just made it very clear to Karen and the whole neighborhood that the days of walking all over me were officially over. The next morning started out unusually quiet for a Thursday. There were no barking dogs, no lawnmowers, and no chatty neighbors taking their morning strolls. It was like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. I stepped onto my porch with a coffee in hand and looked around. Birds were chirping. The sun was already climbing, and the pool sparkled like nothing had ever happened in it. But something had changed. Word had spread fast. Videos of Karen's meltdown had been shared in local Facebook groups and circulated in neighborhood chat threads. One clip recorded by Mrs. Walker from 2 doors down showed Karen slipping into the pool while the alarm blared, and then crawling out shrieking. The caption read, "Justice cannonballed into her ego," and the comments were a mix of laughing emojis and applause gasps. I didn't post it, but I didn't stop it either. By late morning, I got an email from the HOA board. It was an urgent request for me to attend an emergency meeting at the clubhouse that evening. No details, just that my presence was required. I already knew what it was about. I almost didn't go, but I wanted to face it head on. If Karen was going to spin the narrative, I wasn't going to let her do it without resistance. When I arrived at the small clubhouse meeting room, half the neighborhood was already seated. The board members looked tense, papers in hand, and a projector setup flickered against the wall with the HOA logo. Karen sat near the front, dry this time, but her face was still flushed with leftover humiliation. She avoided eye contact with me, which was unusual. Her default mode was smugness and confrontation. Now she just looked tired and rattled. The meeting was called to order quickly. A board member named Thomas, who usually handled landscaping budgets, began reading a formal statement about alleged harassment, misuse of personal security systems, and community disturbance. I folded my hands and waited. Karen then stood with a practiced expression of concern and launched into a speech about how she had always tried to bring neighbors together, how she was confused about property boundaries, and how she feared for her safety after being targeted by an extreme and hostile trap set by a homeowner who refused to cooperate with HOA guidelines. She even used the words psychological warfare and suggested I had endangered public safety with a system designed to induce panic. I let her finish without interrupting. Then the board turned to me. I pulled a folder from my bag, placed it on the table, and calmly said I'd brought documentation to clarify the situation. Inside were printouts of timestamps from my security cameras, images of Karen using the unauthorized key, logs showing the exact times and dates of each intrusion, and a diagram of the sensor system with proof it was legally compliant and posed no physical harm. I had even included Karen's social media post showing her pool party with the location tag. The room grew quiet as each board member passed the papers down, reading in silence. Then I played a short clip from the security feed showing Karen unlocking the gate, entering with her friends, and announcing they wouldn't be bothered today. Karen tried to speak, but the room was no longer on her side. Several neighbors raised their hands one after another. They shared their own experiences of Karen overstepping, issuing false citations, showing up unannounced, and twisting rules to fit her agenda. Someone mentioned how she fined a woman for having wind chimes. Another neighbor brought up how Karen moved a no parking sign closer to someone's driveway just to block their guests. The trickle of complaints turned into a flood. By the end of it, Karen sat with her arms crossed and lips pursed, the room no longer seeing her as a misunderstood community leader, but as the manipulative figure she had always been. The final blow came from Ms. Bennett, a soft-spoken retired judge who had joined the board recently. She raised a hand, stood, and asked if Karen could provide any legal documentation showing she had the right to use my pool or distribute keys. Karen couldn't. She stammered something about verbal agreements and community use spirit, but nothing solid. Ms. Bennett then motioned to suspend Karen's role as HOA president pending formal review. The board voted right there in front of everyone -5-0. Karen's authority dissolved in a matter of minutes. She stood up abruptly, muttered something about not being appreciated, and stormed out of the room, nearly knocking over a chair on her way. I didn't gloat. I just sat there quietly, letting the moment settle. The board turned to me and apologized for the trouble I had experienced. They even asked if I would consider helping the HOA rework its bylaws regarding privacy and security. I declined the offer politely, saying I preferred my role as an observer these days. Later that evening, as I walked home under the fading sunlight, I noticed something different. Neighbors waved more earnestly. A few even clapped me on the back. One guy offered to buy me a beer. Another thanked me for doing what no one else had the nerve to do. I didn't do it for thanks, though. I did it because I was tired of people like Karen turning peaceful neighborhoods into little empires. She had gone unchecked for too long. She thought she could take whatever she wanted, twist rules to suit her whims, and bully anyone who resisted. Not anymore. I sat on the porch that night, watching the glow of the pool lights shimmer across the water. The alarm system was off. There was no need for it tonight. Karen wouldn't be coming back. The power she clung to had finally slipped through her fingers, and now all that remained was the bitter taste of public embarrassment. I didn't feel bad for her. Actions have consequences, and sometimes the only way to get people to stop crossing lines is to install a very loud alarm when they do. I leaned back in my chair, let the cool breeze brush across my face, and took a long breath. The pool was mine again, and so was the peace that came with it. By Friday morning, I figured the storm had passed. Karen had been publicly humiliated, stripped of her HOA presidency, and exposed for trespassing with undeniable video evidence. But what I underestimated was how deeply her need for control ran. Most people would have laid low or moved on, but Karen wasn't like most people. She didn't retreat. She retaliated. It started small and almost laughably predictable. That morning, I found a notice pinned to my door from the county inspector's office. According to it, there had been a complaint about potential code violations on my property. The claim was vague but referred to unauthorized modifications near the pool and suspected electrical hazards. I read it twice, then chuckled and shook my head. The timing was too perfect to be random. Later that afternoon, a white city truck pulled into my driveway. A middle-aged man with a clipboard and sunglasses stepped out and introduced himself as Inspector Davis. He was polite, clearly just doing his job. I welcomed him and gave him the tour. He asked questions, took photos, and made a few notes about the speaker mounts and waterproof housing near the pool fence. I explained everything thoroughly and showed him the product manuals and safety certifications. After about 30 minutes, he closed his clipboard and gave me a nod. He said, off the record, that this wasn't the first time Karen had weaponized the system to harass people. Apparently, I was her 5th target in 2 years. One neighbor had been hit with a fence height complaint, another for a shed that was an inch over the line. Most cases were thrown out, but the stress lingered. That evening, I reviewed my camera footage just to be sure there were no new surprises. Sure enough, at 2:00 in the morning, a shadow appeared on the feed from the backyard cam. Karen. She crept in through the side bushes, holding a jug in one hand and a flashlight in the other. She wasn't being careful this time. She sloshed something into the pool and then tipped it away, looking over her shoulder like a cartoon villain. I rewound the footage and watched it again in disbelief. The next morning, the pool water had a strange tint to it, faint pink streaks near the shallow end. I didn't wait. I called the police, printed screenshots from the video, and prepared a report. When the officer arrived, I showed him everything. He raised an eyebrow when he saw the footage and immediately recognized Karen. Apparently, she had already been the subject of 2 other neighborhood complaints this month alone. He thanked me for my time, filed the report, and told me they'd be delivering a cease and desist order along with a fine for tampering with private property. I asked if I should drain the pool. He told me to wait until the lab results came back. When I finally did drain it later that week, the technician confirmed the substance was non-toxic but likely a form of paint dye. Still, the message was loud and clear. Karen wasn't finished. That afternoon, I received 2 more letters, one from the HOA informing me of multiple complaints filed about my lawn, and another from the city about potential noise violations related to my alarm system. Both were clearly retaliatory. I documented everything, saved every timestamp, every piece of mail, and even recorded a few conversations with neighbors who had witnessed Karen bragging about knowing people in the city office. By the time Sunday rolled around, I had grown tired of waiting for the next stunt. I decided to fight fire with calm, strategic fire. I spent the afternoon crafting a detailed letter to the HOA board outlining a full timeline of Karen's harassment, complete with attachments. I also included screenshots from local community pages where people were mocking the pool incident. One comment in particular stood out. It read, If Karen spent half as much energy cleaning her own backyard as she did messing with others, we'd all have peace. I sent everything to the HOA's legal review officer and CC'd the new board president. I also dropped off a physical copy at the office for their next meeting. Monday morning brought a different kind of visitor. The same city inspector returned, this time with a younger colleague. They weren't there to question me. They were there to ask if I'd be willing to give a statement about Karen's repeated abuse of city complaint channels. Apparently, she had flooded their office with so many petty reports that someone in administration had flagged it for investigation. I told them everything I knew, even gave them access to the nighttime footage. They took notes, thanked me, and said they'd be in touch. Later that evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the rooftops, I heard raised voices outside. I stepped onto the porch and saw Karen standing in front of her house, arguing with a woman in a city uniform. From the distance, I couldn't hear the exact words, but her arm was flailing in the air, and her face had turned the same color as the dye she had dumped into my pool. Eventually, the city worker turned and left while Karen stormed back inside, slamming the door hard enough that a porch decoration fell off its hook. Word of that exchange spread quickly. By Tuesday, people were openly talking about how Karen had finally pushed things too far. Some of the same folks who had once been too nervous to speak up were now sharing their own stories. HOA meeting attendance doubled. A few residents even organized a group to rewrite some of the outdated community guidelines, particularly the ones Karen had exploited for her own benefit. They asked me to join the revision committee. I declined politely but firmly. I told them I'd done my part, and now it was time for the rest of them to make sure no one ever got away with this again. That night, as I sat by the now clean and freshly filled pool, I thought about how far this had gone. What started as a harmless swim in the wrong place had turned into a full-blown war of nerves and petty attacks. But even wars end, and the one thing Karen never counted on was that sometimes when you push the quiet ones too far, they push back harder than anyone else. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break the law, and I didn't back down. I just stayed calm, stayed smart, and let her own behavior undo her. And the best part was, the entire neighborhood saw it happen, not because I wanted attention, but because they needed to see that standing up to people like her wasn't impossible. It just took the right spark. The following weekend brought with it a strange calm, like the eye of a storm that had passed but left debris behind. I thought for a while that maybe Karen had finally accepted defeat. The citations stopped arriving. The mailbox was empty of threats disguised as neighborhood courtesy, and the cameras hadn't caught any new trespassing attempts. I even started sleeping better, assuming that the weight of her public embarrassment and legal pressure had convinced her to back off. I should have known better. When someone like Karen loses control, she doesn't give up, she plots. And on Saturday afternoon, she made her move in the most audacious way possible. It started with the sound of voices, loud ones, too many for a regular stroll or front yard conversation. I stepped onto my porch and stared in disbelief. There, standing at the edge of my lawn, was Karen in full party hostess mode, surrounded by about 15 people holding balloons, lawn chairs, and coolers. They weren't neighbors. They looked like distant cousins or acquaintances who had no idea what kind of war zone they were walking into. Karen had set up a folding table near the sidewalk with snacks and bottled drinks, and she was holding a clipboard like she was hosting a family reunion on my property. I walked down the steps slowly, trying to wrap my head around the scene. Before I could speak, Karen raised her hand with a wide grin and said they were having a spontaneous neighborhood mixer, and that since the pool was now famously popular, they figured it made sense to have it near the most talked about home on the block. I didn't respond. I just scanned the crowd and noticed several people already setting up towels on my front grass and dragging fold-out chairs toward the side gate. One woman even asked where the restroom was. Karen, unfazed by my silence, declared loudly that everyone deserved to feel welcome, even when certain people forgot the meaning of community. That was enough. I turned around and walked back inside, locked the front door, and headed straight to the control panel hidden in the garage. I had installed something extra after the last stunt, a second alarm system This one motion triggered along the perimeter of the lawn, designed specifically for ground-level activity. It wouldn't harm anyone, but it would definitely make an impression. I activated the zone, adjusted the volume on the speakers, and waited. Minutes later, the sensors went live. As soon as the first two guests stepped past the marked boundary I had quietly installed in the grass, the system kicked in. A sharp burst of noise erupted from hidden outdoor speakers, followed by the same blaring alarm tone used in the pool setup. But this time, the voice command was different. It repeated over and over, "Private property. Leave immediately. Surveillance active." Lights embedded in the ground flickered on and off in a pulsing pattern, like an airfield landing zone. The crowd froze. Someone dropped a bag of chips. Another guy backed away slowly, wide-eyed, asking Karen if this was part of the event. Karen tried to speak over the alarm, but her voice cracked with frustration. She yelled that I was being dramatic and childish, that this wasn't necessary. But by then, half the group had already started packing up their things. Two of them walked off without a word, clearly embarrassed. Another apologized directly to me through the front window before quickly retreating. Karen stood there with her fists clenched, her face pale with fury, as she tried to shout over the alarm. I watched from the side window as she attempted to disable the speaker panel, pulling at the cover like she had some right to touch it. But it was locked, bolted down, and wired tight. I let it play out for another minute before shutting off the system remotely. The moment the sound stopped, the silence roared louder than the alarm had. Karen stood alone near the sidewalk, her party supplies scattered, her guests mostly vanished. She looked up at the security camera on the eaves and realized the whole thing had been recorded again. She didn't scream this time. She didn't speak. She just picked up a plastic cup, crushed it in her hand, and walked away. That night, several neighbors reached out, not to scold me but to thank me. They said they were tired of the disruptions, the games, the constant feeling that Karen's drama could spill onto their lawns at any moment. One of them sent me a message saying, "You handled that like a pro." Another dropped off cookies on my porch with a note that read, "For the best fireworks show we've seen in years." I didn't reply to any of them. I just sat outside under the string lights that lined my patio and thought about how absurd this had all become. It had started with a stolen swim and turned into a battle of wills that kept escalating because someone couldn't bear the idea of being told no. On Monday, a new sign went up near the HOA mailbox station. It announced a community vote to amend the association bylaws to address unauthorized events, misuse of member property, and enforcement protocols. It was clear that the board had seen enough and wanted permanent changes in place to prevent another Karen-style reign. I didn't attend the meeting that followed, but I heard from more than one neighbor that the room was packed and that the vote passed with a landslide. By the end of the week, Karen's house had a "for sale" sign in front of it. No fanfare, no open house, just a quiet sign placed in the grass and a notice on the listing page that said "Motivated Seller." She didn't tell anyone she was leaving, didn't make a farewell post in the neighborhood forum, didn't even acknowledge the fallout. One day she was there, and the next she wasn't. Her blinds stayed closed, the yard overgrown, and by Friday, the curtains were gone and the windows bare. I thought I would feel triumphant, maybe even celebratory, but what I felt was relief, not because I had won, but because I had finally gotten my peace back. For the first time in months, I sat by the pool without checking cameras every 10 minutes or wondering what new stunt would come next. I grilled dinner, played soft music, and floated on my back under the stars without interruption. It wasn't just about the alarm or the footage or even the HOA vote. It was about showing someone like Karen that no matter how entitled you feel, you are not above consequences. Some people learn that the hard way and some, like her, don't learn at all. They just move on to the next place and hope the next neighborhood doesn't have someone with a voltage alarm and a backbone. The morning after the "for sale" sign went up on Karen's lawn, I stood by my front window with a fresh cup of coffee and stared across the street, waiting for some sign of movement. But there was nothing. Her driveway was empty, her porch was bare. The curtains had been pulled back in the windows, giving the place a hollow look, like the house had been drained of the energy that once made it the center of conflict. I walked outside and strolled down my driveway, taking in the quiet. No new complaints pinned to my gate. No sudden barking from her side of the fence. The air itself felt lighter. I didn't think she'd leave so quickly. I figured she'd at least drag it out, maybe host one last dramatic gathering or send one more passive-aggressive letter before backing away. But she had vanished like a ghost that had lost interest in haunting a place that no longer feared it. I spent the day cleaning up the last traces of chaos. The lawn was trimmed, the alarm systems double-checked and reset to standby, the cameras repositioned for general security instead of constant surveillance. I even repainted the sign by the pool, the one Karen always used to mock. Before, it simply read, "Private pool, no HOA access." Now it said, in bright, bold letters, "This property bites back." I chuckled as I stepped back to admire it. It wasn't just for her. It was for anyone else who thought about taking advantage of someone too polite to say no the first time. In the days that followed, people started to stop by more often, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. A neighbor who had always kept to himself dropped off a small potted plant and told me quietly that he'd been waiting for someone to finally stand up to her. Another couple invited me over for dinner, saying they felt like the neighborhood was starting fresh and they wanted to celebrate the change. I hadn't realized how many people had felt suffocated until the pressure lifted. It wasn't just me Karen had pushed. It was everyone. But they had all been too tired or too hesitant to confront her. They needed someone to pull the curtain back and show that behind the clipboard and smug smile was just a person who relied on intimidation more than actual authority. The HOA board underwent its own transformation. Meetings were now open to all members. Minutes were published online, and new rules were proposed to ensure no one could act unilaterally again. The bylaws were rewritten with clearer language about private property, party regulations, and trespassing boundaries. A new clause even encouraged members to install non-lethal deterrents if their property had been targeted before. I was asked to speak briefly at one of the meetings just to explain how I'd handled things and what could be learned from it. I kept it short. I told them I wasn't a hero. I was just tired. And sometimes when people get tired enough of being ignored, they make noise the only way they know how. A few weeks later, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. She didn't appear. A crew of strangers handled the packing. Boxes were loaded, furniture wrapped, and by evening, the place was empty, just a hollow shell waiting for someone new to take over. I didn't celebrate. I just sat on my back deck with a glass of iced tea and let the stillness settle in. The lights from the pool reflected on the water in calm ripples. It felt like closure, not just on the chaos, but on something bigger, a reminder that sometimes it takes a little spark to change the whole course of a place. Over time, the memories of the incidents faded into neighborhood folklore. People would laugh about the time the alarm went off during Karen's pool invasion, or the way she slipped trying to pull off her impromptu lawn party. But they laughed without bitterness now. It had become a story of change, not just revenge. I had expected satisfaction to come from the moment the siren blared and exposed her, but it didn't. The real satisfaction came from watching people grow more confident. A mother who used to whisper complaints at the mailbox now voiced concerns directly to the board. A quiet retiree who had stopped attending meetings returned with a smile and a suggestion for new flower beds near the entrance. The place felt alive again, not afraid. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the breeze cooled the air, I lit the grill and set out chairs for a few neighbors who were coming over for a casual dinner. We shared food, swapped stories, and laughed without looking over our shoulders. I realized then that the pool had never been about water or recreation. It was about space, my space, and how easily it can be stolen or reclaimed, depending on who's willing to stand at the gate. As night fell, one of the neighbors, a widower named Phil, raised a glass and said, "Here's to peace earned, not peace given." Everyone nodded. It was a simple statement, but it stuck with me. Peace isn't always passive. Sometimes you have to fight for it, not with fists or shouting, but with strategy, with patience, and with just enough electricity to light up a boundary that should have never been crossed. Later, after everyone had gone home and the lights had dimmed, I sat alone by the pool with my feet in the water. The air was still, the stars were out. I thought about all the time I had wasted worrying about what Karen would do next, and now she was gone. Not defeated in some cinematic way, not banished in glory, just gone. Her reign ended not with a bang, but with a quiet realization that she could no longer control the narrative. I leaned back, let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding for weeks, and whispered to no one in particular, "You picked the wrong pool, Karen." The water shimmered in response, peaceful and undisturbed, just the way it was meant to be.